Russia mobilises troops across the country for the first time since World War II as the fight in Ukraine threatens to ramp up. How the Reserve Bank lost $45 billion, at least on paper, and La Niña set to hit the East Coast in coming days. It's Thursday, the 22nd of September 2022. Welcome to Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael. What are you doing for the public holiday today?
Well, for one thing, I'll be having a slightly shorter episode of Fear and Greed this morning. We've scaled things back just a little bit, just a touch, just to recognise the fact that it is a public holiday today. Did you know, Sean, I was reading some comments from Dr. Shane Oliver from AMP about the cost of a one-off public holiday.
What did it say?
He said that in the worst case scenario, that a single public holiday like the one we have today could cut $9 billion from September quarter GDP. Isn't that huge? And he said that is likely to be a fairly significant exaggeration, but it makes for a cracking headline, doesn't it?
It does make for a cracking headline. And, of course, the GDP itself would be worth hundreds of billions of dollars. But still, never let truth get in the way of a good story.
No, and especially when you think, though, then there's a lot of people that would also then take tomorrow off as well. I mean, for one thing, it is a public holiday, of course, in Melbourne, but it's also a day then when a lot of people can know that they just take one more day of annual leave and suddenly you've got a 4-day weekend.
Yeah, totally.
Anyway, look, we are making this podcast now much longer than it needs to be because we are doing a slightly shorter version for the public holiday. So we do have a bit to chat about. You've got a conversation today, an interview coming up after the show with Richard Kuipers from a fairly recognisable business, really, Two Men and a Truck.
Yes, it's a story of building a family business, succession planning. Two Men and a Truck is a removalist company and started in the mid-'80s with two men and a truck. And they've now become a massive operation. Richard has run the show from the get-go. Fascinating story.
Yeah, and it's all about kind of how to set it up for Succession. And
that's right. Yeah.
You've talked about how we love the show Succession here, and this is an example of it, really a homegrown example of how it can be done successfully. But that's all coming up a little bit later on. The main story this morning, Sean, is everything that's happening in geopolitics at the moment. Russian President Vladimir Putin has ordered his country's first mobilisation of reserve troops since World War II, in what is really a pretty dramatic escalation of the conflict in Ukraine. President Putin made a televised address yesterday where he warned that the country would use all available means to protect its people, adding that, quote, "It is not a bluff." It is a partial mobilisation of troops, so it'll see 300,000 reserves called up. It'll also apply to those with previous military experience. It's a pretty frightening development.
It sure is. Mr. Putin claims the West wants to weaken, divide and destroy Russia. He accused Western leaders of engaging in nuclear blackmail and vowed to respond to any threats against his country. Perhaps most alarming was his thinly veiled threat to use nuclear weapons if necessary. I mentioned last week that Ukrainian forces are taking more territory from Russian invaders, particularly in the Kharkiv province. Russia holds about 60% of the neighbouring Donetsk region and nearly all of the Luhansk province. But the Russian supply lines that run through Kharkiv have now been lost, perhaps contributing to the escalation.
And I think that the timing is particularly interesting, Sean, with US President Joe Biden set to address the United Nations, really targeting Russia.
That's right. The White House says President Biden will offer a firm rebuke of Russia's unjust war in Ukraine and make a call to the world to continue to stand against the naked aggression that we've seen these past several months. He's looking to shore up support for the Ukrainian resistance, but it feels like the stakes have now become even higher.
Yeah, indeed. Well, now, what's this mean for international markets and kind of particularly oil?
Well, it certainly put pressure on oil. Crude oil jumped more than 2% after President Putin's announcement about mobilisation amid fears of a tighter oil and gas supply. Financial markets are already on edge this week with central banks around the world holding meetings. The US Federal Reserve hiked interest rates overnight and the central banks of Japan and UK will announce further rate rises later in the week. Like it's been pretty much all year, uncertainty seems to be the catch cry of markets at the moment.
Yeah, and locally, we've got obviously the public holiday today, so the ASX is closed. But how did the markets wrap up yesterday?
The S&P ASX 200 dropped 1.6% or 106 points to 6,700 points. That's ahead of the Federal Reserve's meeting overnight. The big miners fell, with Fortescue off more than 4% and BHP down more than 3%. The banks, the retailers, the energy companies, they all fell. Telstra was about the best performing large cap, up more than 1%. Plenty of other action going on. Link Group tumbled nearly 4% after its British subsidiary was hit with an extra £50 million fine by a British financial regulator over the Woodford Fund's collapse in 2019. Brickworks added about 0.5% after posting record earnings and lifting its dividend. Washington H. Soul Pattinson, which of course is very closely linked to Brickworks, rose 5% after reporting its full-year results, and Viva Energy added 5% after buying Coles Express in a deal worth $300 million.
All right, we'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, yesterday, Reserve Bank Deputy Governor Michelle Bullock revealed that the COVID pandemic support measure to buy $300 billion worth of bonds lost money.
Yes, I mean, you'll remember that bond buying was part of the COVID support measures of quantitative easing, ensuring that money was available to support government spending and the economy. At one point, the Reserve Bank was buying $5 billion worth of federal and state government debt per week, and by February this year had bought $224 billion of federal debt and $57 billion of state and territory government debt. Meanwhile, interest rates have been going back up. So what's that happened? It means prices of bonds are falling. So if you buy a bond for $100 and it's down to $95, you've lost $5, and that's exactly what's happened to the Reserve Bank. At least on paper. These are paper losses. Until they actually sell the bonds, they don't realise the loss, and indeed they could just hold on to the bonds, and in fact they would never have made that loss at all. Overall, Michelle Bullock said the bank had made underlying earnings of $8.2 billion during the last financial year and a valuation loss of $44.9 billion. That's $45 billion because of the bond market sell-off. That leaves a $37 billion loss all up last financial year.
What a way to start a public holiday with a lesson in bonds there, Sean.
God, really get the heart going.
It sure does. All right, now Whitehaven Coal could spend more than $2 billion buying back its own shares during this financial year on the back of extraordinary coal prices.
Whitehaven asked investors for permission to purchase up to 25% of its shares on issue in the year ahead. It suggests a record near $2 billion profit achieved in the year to June could be exceeded this financial year. Of course, prices for top quality New South Wales thermal coal have been very high, in fact above $420 per tonne over the past month, more than double what it was less than a year ago.
Now, this is an interesting one, Sean. Santos will not be allowed to drill 8 wells in the Barossa gas field, 265 k's northwest of Darwin, after the federal court found the oil giant failed to consult local Indigenous people adequately on the development.
That's right. The landmark case was the first significant judgment in a challenge to mining approvals based on whether applicants had adequately consulted Indigenous people from the proposed development sites. It potentially sets a precedent for a slew of future claims. A Manupi elder filed a case to challenge the offshore drilling regulator's decision to allow Santos to drill the wells, arguing the gas giant had not considered his people's connection to the sea country, despite being required to do so by the National Offshore Petroleum Safety and Environmental Management Authority.
Now, Sean, there's been a shocking story out of the AFL in the last 24 hours. Hawthorn, which isn't playing in the grand final this weekend, is dealing with horrific allegations relating to their treatment of Indigenous players.
Yes, Michael, and this is a confronting subject matter on so many levels. In the days before the grand final, the AFL should be celebrating the best aspects of the season, and instead, yesterday, awful allegations emerged. The Hawthorn Football Club recently undertook an external review into the treatment of current and former First Nations players. That review has not been publicly released, but yesterday the ABC detailed allegations contained in the report, claiming that the club demanded some First Nations players split from their partners and live separately from their family. AFL Chief Executive Gil McLachlan has described the alleged treatment of First Nations players at Hawthorn Football Club challenging, harrowing and disturbing, and said the claims need to be properly investigated. He said, "We need to provide natural justice and allow that process to go on, but we will seek to have that firmly in place as quickly as possible. A panel of 4 independent experts is being assembled to be led by a King's Counsel, where the investigation will allow the accused to be heard.
I mentioned at the top of the show, Sean, that the symptoms of La Nina are hitting the East Coast again. We are in for a very wet summer by the sounds of it. Communities in central and northwestern New South Wales, as well as southern Queensland, are all bracing now for heavy rains and potential floods.
Yes, Michael, dams were already full and grounds have been sodden for some time. The central west slopes and plains in New South Wales had heavy rains in the past week. They were hoping to avoid a predicted 70 millimetres overnight. The Bureau of Meteorology has issued warnings for some areas and expects the rain to move towards the east coast today and tomorrow.
I have a very extensive lawn care regime, Sean.
You do, I know.
That relies on this rain just holding off for a little bit longer. So this is not good news for me. I'm driven by self-interest, which is something that you're familiar with.
I'm thinking more about those flood affected than your lawn, Michael.
Wow, way to put me back in my place there, Sean. All right, finally, this is not related really to business news at all, but just a quick mention for some really quite sad news. For those of us who have enjoyed Play School at various times across the years, I don't know whether you remember the host, John Hamblin, who was known as Naughty John. He died yesterday at the age of 87.
I am one of those that remember him from my younger years. He was a Play School presenter for almost 30 years between 1970 and 1999. He was known to be a master of the cheeky smile, the witty one-liner, and his performances were popular with children and adults alike.
All right, now up next, Sean, is the Fear and Greed Daily interview, and you're speaking today with Richard Kuipers from Two Men in a Truck.
Yes, as we mentioned at the top of the show, the story of building a family business. And what do you do when you want to exit it and you need to pass it on to your descendants? And of course, this is well before anything happens to Richard. He's still running it well and truly at the moment, but it's a very interesting chat about succession and how he's gone about doing that.
Yeah, it's a good story and he tells it well. It's coming up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It's Thursday, the 22nd of September, 2022. Make sure you're following the podcast and join us online on LinkedIn, Twitter and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.